To me, the Limberlost is a word with which to conjure, a spot wherein to revel. There are miles of unbroken forest. You are with the infinite, earth that bears trees from 10 to 14 feet in circumference, with up to 60 feet to the branching, set almost touching each other.
In 1910, Gene Stratton-Porter, author and naturalist, became the voice of the Limberlost. This 13,000-acre swamp that stretched across 3 counties in eastern Indiana was named for a settler called Limber Jim, who was lost in its vastness. Under its deep forest lay the greatest oil and natural gas field in Indiana, the Trenton Lima deposits. From Geneva, a boomtown on the northern edge of the Limberlost, millions of barrels of oil were piped for Standard Oil of Ohio. Timber was sent to the furniture factories of Grand Rapids, Michigan. In 1889, at the beginning of this boom period, Gene Stratton-Porter, a young wife and mother, came to Geneva to join her husband, Charles Porter, the town's successful druggist. The move to Geneva would change her life, for it brought her to the Limberlost swamp, which shaped her life's work. Her books would awaken the love of nature in the hearts of Americans. She wrote of the restorative powers of nature. Her fictional characters, driven by the stress of increasing industrialism, turned to nature and thus emerged stronger and cleansed. From 1910 until her death in 1924, Gene Stratton-Porter's books, selling more copies than those of any other American author, reached a worldwide audience of 25 million readers.
While other writers in the Midwest moved to the cities in pursuit of their career, Gene Stratton-Porter went into the swamp, the great Limberlost swamp near her home in Indiana, to look at the creatures there, the moths and the birds and the trees and the ferns and the wildflowers, and to write about them and to write about the people who loved them. What we need at this time in our history is a literature not of departures, not of exile, but a literature of inhabitation, a literature about how we might dwell in our places and live there with a full heart. It seems to me that Gene Stratton-Porter gave us such a literature early in this century.
Geneva Grace Stratton, later to be known as Jeanne, began her life on the family farm near LaGros, Indiana, on August 17, 1863. She wrote of her birth in Laddie, an autobiographical novel.
Mother was 46 and father was 50, so they felt young enough yet to have a fine time and enjoy life, and just when things were going best, I arrived. No one wanted me, as there had been 3 boys and 8 girls. Everyone felt that was enough. But Laddie, my older brother, welcomed me and loved me from the first. He took me to the fields with him in the morning. He always had patience to explain every leaf, bird, and flower I asked him about. The farm hands shooting birds that ate the fruit in our orchard were so distressing to me that my father stopped the practice. One morning he called me to him.
Geneva, I have a gift for you, straight from the hands of the Creator. I give you the ownership of each bird that makes its home on my land.
From that hour in which they became my personal property, every bird took on new beauty and coloring, new grace in flight. I had so many nests that it was impossible to visit them all in one day, so I chose 64.
Her family called her the Little Bird Woman. The health and life of the birds was to become the symbol for Gene Stratton-Porter of the health and future of the environment. Jean's idyllic farm childhood was about to change. One Saturday evening, her brother Laddie, swimming with friends, was challenged to swim the Wabash River. Never a strong swimmer, Laddie made the attempt and was drowned.
I ran to the house, screaming for my mother with one of Laddie's boots in each hand.
At 9 years of age, Jeanne lost her beloved brother. In the next 2 years, her mother's health failed, and her father felt he couldn't run the farm alone. The loss of Gene Stratton-Porter's secure family home gave her, at an early age, the sense of dislocation and loss that many displaced farm families were experiencing at the end of the 19th century. She moved to what seemed to her a city. Wabash, the county seat, was a thriving town, enjoying a boom as a rail and canal center, surrounded by factories. With his wife's health failing rapidly, Mark Stratton settled his family in the home of his married daughter, Anastasia Taylor. Less than 4 months after moving to town, Mary Stratton died. She was laid to rest in the family cemetery beside Laddie.
Round my Indiana homestead wave the cornfields. In the distance loom the woodlands clear and cool. Oftentimes my thoughts revert to scenes of childhood, where I first received my lessons, nature school. But one thing there is missing in the picture. Without her face, it seems so incomplete. I long to see my mother in the doorway, as she stood there years ago, her girl to greet.
Although she was a good student, Jeanne never finished high school.
Like Thoreau, I never worried about diplomas. What measure of success I have had comes through preserving my individual point of view, through the line of education my father was able to give me.
Her father, Mark Stratton, encouraged Jeanne's writing and exchanged farm produce to give her painting lessons. Her educational opportunities were expanded when she visited Sylvan Lake at Rome City, home of one of the most popular resorts in northern Indiana. The Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, which owned property on Sylvan Lake, conducted a summer Chautauqua, attracting thousands from miles around. The series of programs featured religious lecturers, musical artists, and performers such as James Whitcomb Riley, the beloved Indiana folk poet.
Little orphaned Annie's come to our house to stay, and wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away. And all us other children, when the supper things is done, we set around the kitchen fire and has the mostest fun, a-listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins that get you if you don't watch out.
21-year-old Jeanne enjoyed all the social aspects of the lake.
The splashing of oars, the echoing peals of joyous laughter from friendly and strange voices, music and addresses, the busy throng of pleasure seekers, the quiet, cozy evening of the camp.
The experiences at the Chautauqua were Jeanne's open door to adulthood. This was the summer that Charles Dorwin Porter, an up-and-coming owner of a drugstore in Geneva, Indiana, saw this striking gray-eyed young woman and was attracted to her personality that stood out from the crowd. Charles, aware of the 13 years difference in age, sent a formal letter to Jeanne.
There are certain instances that occur that prompt us to do some rather foolish things. I venture the forwardness to address you. Barring the rules of etiquette, I would respectfully solicit a correspondence with you.
If you even glanced at me, I was totally unconscious of the fact. But if you noted me sufficiently to remember me this long, then I am sure that you saw also that I behave in a quiet and ladylike manner. But can I keep it up if I correspond with an entire stranger?
Separated by his work in Decatur and Geneva from his Jeannie, as Charles Porter called her, the courtship proceeded slowly. His Jeannie clearly stated her position.
You have concluded that I favor matrimony. Well, so I do, for the men. I regard the pure and lovable wife as the best safeguard to man's honor, the comfortable and happy home as his rightful resting place. That's for the man. And for every such a home, some woman is the sacrificial flame that feeds the altar. Do not think me a howler for women's rights. I am not, but I sincerely believe that 9 girls out of every 10 have killed themselves at it. It sets me to pondering on the difference between a man's engaged love and his married love.
Charles's visits to Jeanne in Wabash eventually overcame her doubts.
You say I am dearer to you than all else on earth. Do you know what I have a great mind to do? Just believe it and be happy. I want you for a change to have something of your very own, to have a home, to come to the tender love of one who will look beautiful to you at least.
Charles settled his new bride in his family home of Decatur. The years of boarding around with relatives were over at last. Marriage to Charles Porter brought Jeanne to the threshold of a new life, a secure home, the nurturing soil for her creative growth. Charles left their Decatur home during the week to work in his drugstore in Geneva. In 1887, a daughter, Jeanette, was born to Charles and Jeanne.
When Jeanette was 2 years old, I saw the trips between Decatur and Geneva were wearing on Charles and urged him to move the family to Geneva.
Geneva in 1889 was a railhead and center for harvesting natural resources of timber, oil, and gas for burgeoning industries. The town of Geneva lay on the northern boundary of the 13,000-acre Limberlost swamp that had been part of a 25,000-acre system of wetlands in eastern Indiana. Oil drilling began in earnest in the 1890s, speeding up the depletion of the forests and the draining of the Limberlost.
Charles moved Jeanette and me into Geneva. Our little yellow house was set on a lot with an orchard and barn for horses. Happy to have my own home, I was pleased as Jeanette grew to see her exploring fields and streams with the neighborhood children.
Typically, Jeanne, like the other ladies in Geneva, took up embroidery and china painting. Less typically, she addressed the Geneva Literary Club with a stirring tribute to Walt Whitman's then controversial poem, Leaves of Grass.
If you love God's creation above man's manufacturing, read the book. If in your heart there is of universal love and pity, read the book. You will be better off for it.
The lumber and oil boom changed the Porters' fortunes. It brought many opportunities to Charles. He built a larger drugstore building that could also house the bank that he helped organize. The 365-acre farm he owned produced 60 working oil wells. The Porters visited Chicago for the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, held in 1893.
I was impressed with the woodwork of the Exposition's forestry building, and I asked Charles to build a new house in Geneva. We designed a 14-room cabin of Wisconsin cedar logs and redwood. We named our new home Limberlost Cabin.
A gift from Jeanette inspired Jeanne to begin a new career.
I was allowed to put Major, our parrot, on the back of a chair at the dining table. I took an oyster out of my plate, and he ate the whole thing with much delight. Mother remarked, "I wish I had a camera. I certainly would like to take a picture of a parrot eating an oyster." It was near Christmas time. By saving all my spare pennies, I bought her first camera, a little 4x5 Vive.
I worked with cameras with glass plate exposures. The work involved locating the nest, setting, focusing, and concealing the camera. I was using knowledge acquired in childhood. It's necessary to move slowly, to live among the birds until one thoroughly understands their characteristics and habits, to remain near their location until they are accustomed to you as part of their daily life. The best friend I ever had in field work, Mr. Bob Black, an oil man operating leases beside the Wabash River, spent his spare time for several seasons locating nests for me.
Jeanne was drawn more and more to the depths of the Limberlost by her bird studies.
I knew what situation for her nest each bird would choose, how she would build, brood, and care for her young. The birds had not changed in the slightest, nor had I.
By 1900, Jeanne was writing articles on wildlife photography for Recreation and Outing magazines. She was scornful of photographers or illustrators who killed birds after they used them as subjects. In an article, Bird Photography, in Recreation magazine, Gene Stratton-Porter cautioned amateur photographers.
We are called on to face a new outrage on the birds, not on the game birds alone, but also against our birds of exquisite song. The immediate demand for nest pictures to illustrate magazine and newspaper articles have set the photographic world afire. Probably as many birds perish because of torn-out nests as fell before the guns of pot hunters. While I photograph the nests, and in many cases the brooding birds, I never take out, photograph, or handle the baby birds or frighten the mothers.
Her growing reputation as a bird photographer brought her to the attention of Edward Bach, editor of the Ladies' Home Journal. The series of articles she wrote gained for Jeanne a large national public. She was later to make a book from the articles. In 1903, Jeanne took the risk of sending her first story, Laddie, the Princess and the Pie, to Metropolitan magazine. She had the joy of seeing it in print.
Then I took a bold step, the first in my self-emancipation. Money was beginning to come in, and I had some in my purse of my very own. I argued that if I kept my family comfortable, I had a right to do what I could toward furthering my personal ambitions. In time I could save for that purpose.
Encouraged by the publication of her first story, she thought of combining fiction with her nature work.
Coming in from field work one day, I found a cardinal bird lying in the middle of the road, its bright head limp, its brave song hushed, merely to prove that some fiend with a gun could hit a shining mark. I got out of the carriage and, picking it up, carried it home, and every step of the way I grew angrier. By the time I reached home, the book was to all purposes written.
The Song of the Cardinal told the story of a pair of nesting cardinals faithful in their mating for life. This book captured the long-held fascination Jeanne had with the natural, healthy life of the bird family. The book was illustrated with her own photographs. Indiana, at the turn of the century, was experiencing a literary renaissance. Booth Tarkington, George Ade, and James Whitcomb Riley, popular writers, used local speech and settings for their books. Gene Stratton-Porter was undoubtedly influenced by their style. Charles C. Hart, a reporter for the Geneva Herald, recalled how he gave Gene Stratton-Porter her first press notice.
I raved on to something more than half a column about the author's work. That press notice, the very first she ever had, produced for me the friendship of Gene Stratton-Porter and her husband. And if there was one quality she possessed more than another, it was gratitude.
The setting for Song of the Cardinal was Indiana farmland, but Freckles, her next book and first popular novel, drew her into the heart of the Limberlost. In Freckles, Gene Stratton-Porter takes her readers beyond the fear of this dark and unknown wilderness. A one-armed orphan boy, Freckles, is hired by a lumber company to guard their valuable tract of timber. Freckles, afraid at first, is forced by his job to go into the swamp, but he soon begins to learn its secrets.
And now the Limberlost did not contain last year's terrors. He had sounded the depths of her deepest pools and learned why the trees grew so magnificently. All his fears were forgotten. Instead, he was possessed by an overpowering desire to know. To him, whose early life had been so embittered by neglect and cruelty in parents toward their children, the love of these feathered folk of the Limberlost for their young was a miracle.
As Jeanette grew older, Jeanne took her daughter with her during her field work. Jeanette recalled the trip that inspired a key scene in Freckles.
The next spring, while Mother was wandering in the outskirts of the Limberlost, a huge feather fell at her feet. It was from the wing of a black vulture. She saw the bird come into view and disappear into the swamp. After a diligent hunt, she found it in the hollow trunk of a tree. The nest was 7 feet from the opening. My father crept into the log. As Mother told the story, she described the hardships of their work.
The odor of the vulture's rotting food was so unbearable that we could work only by dipping our handkerchiefs in disinfectant, then binding them over our mouths and nostrils. When Mr. Porter brought it out, the baby was white and soft as a powder puff. We at once named the baby Little Chicken.
In her book, Mother described Freckles making the same discovery of a vulture's nest.
In A Girl of the Limberlost, Elnora is rejected by her mother, Kate. Against her mother's wishes, she learns to sell moths, earning her way through high school. Gene Stratton-Porter describes the growing prosperity of the local landowners when Wesley, a neighbor of Kate, advises her to sell $6,000 worth of rare timber off her farm, telling her to sign a lease to pull thousands from the ground in oil, as the rest of the farmers are doing. Elnora's mother, Kate, argues Gene Stratton-Porter's point of view.
Cut down these trees, cover everything with horrid, greasy oil. I'll die first.
I used my own experience with the large and beautiful night moths of the Limberlost to create a scene in the book. In this scene, Kate has destroyed a valuable moth her daughter needs to sell for school money. Kate, although she fears the swamp, follows a moth in flight into its darkness.
This way. Oh, Lord, please make it fly this way.
The moth touched a leaf near the lantern and settled. As Mrs. Comstock reached for it, a thin yellow spray wet her hand and liberally sprayed her dress front and arms. She became the best moth bait ever invented.
They are mine, my salvation. God and the Limberlost gave them to me, so I can go home and face my girl.
Again in this book, Gene Stratton-Porter expresses her views through a mentor character. The birdwoman counsels the 15-year-old Elnora with the words,
"What you are lies with you. If you are lazy and accept your lot, you may live in it. If you are willing to work, you can write your name anywhere you choose, among the only ones who live beyond the grave in this world, the people who help and work for others. Never mind the calico dress and the coarse shoes. Work at your books, and before long you will hear yesterday's tormentors boasting that they were once classmates of yours."
In A Girl of the Limberlost, Elnora takes the birdwoman's advice, rejuvenating the lives of all around her by drawing them closer to the life she experiences in nature. An understanding of the Limberlost becomes the bridge that allows Elnora and her mother to finally become close. With its universal message of hope and redemption, A Girl of the Limberlost attracted the millions of nature-loving readers that made Gene Stratton-Porter one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century. During her work on this book, Jeanne increased her knowledge of the night moths of the swampland. Her photographic studies inspired her book, Moths of the Limberlost. Jeanette recalls her mother's dedication to the research for this book.
Almost any place in our house you might find baby caterpillars just hatched and newly emerging moths and butterflies feeding on flowers in the conservatory.
Repeatedly, I have gone through the entire life process, from mating newly emerged moths, the egg period, caterpillar life with its complicated molts and changes, its spinning of the cocoons, the miraculous winter sleep, to the spring appearance, and with my cameras recorded each stage of development. Then on platinum paper, printed so lightly from these negatives as to give only an exact reproduction of forms, and with watercolor medium, I copied each mark, line, and color gradation, in most cases from the living moth at its prime.
Her description of the life cycles and behavior of these moths remains one of the most informed and readable books on these fragile, beautiful insects. She wrote Music of the Wild.
I think Mother's sense of hearing was the most acute of any person's I have ever known. She could be perfectly quiet under a tree in a forest, hear each sound, distinguish it from others, and tell you what it was.
Every voice of each living creature, with the leaf rustle of the trees, the murmur of waters, the whisper of winds, all these unite to form one great and throbbing anthem. And if you once learn this wildest of music, it will become so sacred to you that its call will be with you always, and when it is most insistent, you will find peace only in the forest.
Gene Stratton-Porter knew that land must support human beings, but she hoped the humans would use the resources of the land wisely. In her chapter, Song of the Fields, she emphasizes her support for the wise use of land. She praises farmers who save trees for the birds, creek beds for fish, and work in concert with nature.
Many volumes could be filled with the history of old stake fences and their inhabitants. Some of our rarest birds home in the shrub-filled corners, or swing from branches above. Compare the number of oriole nests you can find in deep forest or open woods with those in fields and orchards. Nowhere in its course to the river does the Limberlost Creek sing as exultantly as when crossing the meadow. The children play along its banks. The creek is a thing of beauty as it goes laughing on its way to the Wabash.
As Gene Stratton-Porter's work, fame, and prosperity grew, the Limberlost, the source of her field studies and inspiration, diminished.
Although it is not so easy to attack the swamp, on all sides man is pressing close. Big ditches are being dredged, leading from the marshes lying highest on the face of the earth to lower bodies of running water, so that the marsh is leveled by several feet, giving an unbelievable amount of space that soon dries for cultivation.
Changes also shook the personal lives of the Porters. Jeanette Porter left finishing school. She was in love with a man who didn't have her parents' approval. Blaine Monroe sold oil leases in the Geneva area. He and 21-year-old Jeanette obtained a marriage license before asking the Porters for their blessing. They were married in the Porters' home and then left to live in Pennsylvania. By 1909, there were 650 oil wells pumping in the Geneva area. 60 of these wells belonged to Charles Porter.
Because my working territory had been swept clean of trees by lumber dealers, drilled by oilmen, drained and broken into corn and potato fields, there was no longer material to be found for my cameras and my natural history work.
Early in this century, Gene Stratton-Porter was paying attention to what we would now call ecological concerns. For example, she stressed the importance of preserving wetlands, not only for all the other creatures that need to live in those wetlands and depend on them, but for our own sake, because unless we protect our waters, our soils, and our air, we too will suffer.
The forest and swamp around Sylvan Lake in northern Indiana had not yet suffered such devastation. Remembering my happy early years on the lake, I purchased a bungalow and began to scout for a permanent location to build a year-round home.
The woods at Sylvan Lake may have inspired The Harvester, which was to become one of Gene Stratton-Porter's most successful novels.
The idea of writing The Harvester came from an editor who wanted a magazine article about growing ginseng.
The Harvester also reflects Mrs. Porter's interest in the arts and crafts movement. The main character, David, the harvester, does wood carving, using moths and designs suggested to him by his daily life in the woods. Ruth, the heroine of The Harvester, and her mother had worked in an embroidery factory in Chicago. Ruth's talent in creating flower and nature designs led to an artistic partnership with David. David envisions a girl to fall in love with, but when Ruth comes to him in reality, she is physically and mentally devastated by the death of her mother. She feels guilt and shame that her mother worked herself to death in a city factory. David, the harvester, helps Ruth to bury her anguish and her grief, allowing both of them to become strong enough to help her aged grandparents to health. The Harvester is Gene Stratton-Porter's first book in which a mature relationship between a man and woman is based on their mutual strength of character.
With the income of my 3 best-selling books available to me, I explored the dream of 30 years, to purchase and restore the homestead of my childhood. I returned to LeGros only to find the old homestead had burned. The rail fences with their sheltering arms for flowers and bird nests had been replaced by wire. there was little left of the home I'd known. Instead, I turned to memories of my childhood home and created Laddie. I could write no truer biography. To the contour of hill and field, to the last stripe on the wallpaper and knot on the door, that is the home in which I was born.
Ironically, it was in the year of Laddie's publication that Lemon, the brother closest in age to Jeanne, died, leaving his daughter Leah Mary an orphan. According to her brother's dying wish, Jeanne took this niece into her home to raise.
In his last will, he left me his motherless little daughter of 12, so I shall have one more little girl to love and help all I can.
In the spring of 1914, the Porters' new home on Sylvan Lake at Rome City was finished.
Limberlost Cabin North stood on the shores of a lake I have always loved. 120 acres had 3 different pieces of forest remaining on it, one consisting of about 30 acres of forest very nearly primeval. On this location, I was free to express my individuality because I was building this house with my own earnings. I knew Mr. Porter's taste well enough to know what he liked, so I shaped the interior to suit his individuality without destroying mine.
For many years, Jeanne had noted, with what was to her a deep personal pain, the ruthless destruction of Indiana's wildflowers. Even before the house was completed, she began long journeys into nearly all northern Indiana swamps, bearing triumphantly back to her Limberlost safety all the specimens she could rescue.
Life became one round of hunt, seek, and search from morning until night to rescue every one of those delicate little blossoms possible before destruction overtook them. So far, we have brought in over 1,500 plants, vines, and bushes since spring.
Many of these wildflowers are now rare or endangered species.
When I purchased the land for my new home, I called in a tree surgeon, Frank Wallace, to assess the health of the trees on the property.
During the winter, the cabin was virtually snowbound. In this peaceful atmosphere, work on Mrs. Porter's novel Michael O'Halloran was begun. Although Fort Wayne, Indiana was the city best known to Jeanne, she had frequently visited Chicago and Philadelphia, so she called the composite city in Michael O'Halloran Multiopolis.
In the fall of 1915, Mother visited us in Philadelphia. As we were hurrying home from a shopping trip, a little newsboy asked us to buy a paper.
"You have a kind face, lady. Far down the street I saw you coming, and I thought you'd buy a paper."
Mother bought all his papers and sent him off with enough money to buy supper for his entire family. This incident inspired the character of the newsboy Michael in her book.
In Michael O'Halloran, Gene Stratton-Porter once more contrasts the physical and spiritual poverty of the city with the healing powers of nature. This book is about a marriage and the relationship between men and women. The strongest contrast is between 2 orphan children, Mickey and Lily Peaches, and the wealthy Minturns, whose child has died due to their neglect. Mickey helps Lily to overcome her abusive past by giving her a clear understanding of his expectations, allowing her to freely express her fears. Mickey accepts her as she is, giving her room to change. He finally wins them a home on a farm in the country. Mrs. Minturn, without the help or support of her husband, redeems herself by helping children. But Mr. Minturn's understanding is long in coming. Before they can rebuild their marriage on a new and solid foundation, he must admit his own responsibility for their failed family. Perhaps her daughter Jeanette's unhappy marriage and ultimate divorce from Blaine Monroe was in Gene Stratton-Porter's thoughts when she wrote Michael O'Halloran.
Wildflower Woods, the house at Sylvan Lake, offered a haven to Jeanette and my granddaughters, little Jeanette and Jeanne.
I moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana, only 30 miles from Wildflower Woods, so that we could often go back and forth for visits.
My older granddaughter I named Morning Face, almost at birth, partly because she is always smiling.
The new home allowed Jeanne to surround herself with her large Stratton family.
It was the first trip out into the big world when we went to visit Aunt Jeanne at the cabin. She insisted that my family needed a rest, and so we went, and I went out in the boat with Aunt Jeanne, and we went swimming every day.
The spring of 1917 was to be the end of our peaceful family gatherings for some years. With the United States declaration of war on Germany, Bill Thompson, my driver and best field worker, enlisted. The day Bill went to war, he and I planted a big bed of wildflowers. Bill lifted a last spade of earth, slipped off his work gloves, and dropped them in the hole. I could have given money, any degree of talent I possessed, cheerfully, but not the boy.
During the war, Jeanne received many letters from the front. One young soldier wrote,
In a drenching rain, we reached our campsite. I threw my bedding roll down in a mud hole. I began to read A Girl of the Limberlost. I surely enjoyed it. The nature suggestions brought me back to myself again.
The war has been a terror from the beginning, and now that it is taking our nearest and dearest, it comes home with a new meaning. I read that a battle is raging at Toul, and think of my sister's son, Donald. To all I felt before is now added the deadly chill of apprehension that no one can know until their own flesh and blood are in it.
Turning to nature for solace, she wrote Homing with the Birds, recalling many of her unusual experiences in fieldwork with birds.
A mother robin nesting in one flooding rain has always been a marvel to me. She brooded, sheltering eggs, without once having left her nest for 90 hours.
About Homing with the Birds, Christopher Morley, the English critic, wrote to Doubleday, Gene Stratton-Porter's publisher, that her stories of her bird friends are a kind of education in the fullness of life. Her great work with birds is comparable to the studies of the famous Fobb with insects. In her next novel, Daughter of the Land, set in a farm community, Gene Stratton-Porter explored the striving of a daughter to own and farm land on an equal footing with her brothers. Perhaps it expressed Jean's farewell to her own farm roots.
With the help of Frank Wallace, I went into a big push to save as many wildflowers as possible from the swamp dredging that was now starting in Noble County. In 10 days, we moved 1,204 flowers, vines, shrubs, and trees onto the grounds of Wildflower Woods. Frequently, I was so tired I could scarcely reach the cabin at night.
With a hard winter came the terrible influenza epidemic of 1919, and Jeanne, with her sturdy constitution, was fortunate to survive it.
I broke down with the flu, with no nurse and a doctor 40 miles away. In desperation, I fled to California.
The city of Los Angeles had easy access to the sea, mountains, and deserts. The surrounding country was still wild and natural, unspoiled by man's development.
I sorta like this glorious sunshine, the pergola of Cherokee roses, the orange trees and blood-red poinsettias and mockingbirds tame as robins at home. I purchased a house on 4th and Serrano in Los Angeles. Jeanette brought my granddaughters to live here after she divorced Blaine Monroe. 3 of my Stratton relatives lived within a mile of us.
Charles Porter, tied to his business in Indiana, managed to break away for West Coast vacations with his family. In California, for the first time, Gene Stratton-Porter was welcomed by artists and intellectuals such as Charles Lummis, editor of the Los Angeles Times and founder of the Southwest Museum.
I have laid aside my breeches and boots. Although Edward Curtis, the Indian photographer, made a new boots and breeches picture of me in one of the canyons the other day.
Inspired by Edward Curtis's Indian pictures and a flood legend in which the Firebird figures prominently, Gene Stratton-Porter created her own narrative poem, The Firebird.
I used the Indian legend concerning the flood and my cardinal, the Firebird. This story is true to the life of the Indian people described. The setting begins with the Indians of British Columbia in the region of Vancouver. The flight of Princess Yiyata runs eastward to the region of the Mandans, approximately north of the Dakotas.
Inspired by a sincere interest in Native American culture, Gene Stratton-Porter remembered her childhood visits to a Miami Indian family that lived near the Stratton farm in LaGrow, Indiana. The demands of her huge popular audience soon brought her new opportunities as a magazine columnist.
I have been writing regularly for McCall's. I have been interested in helping pull that publication from a loss of $35,000 to $1 million in profit, and a circulation exceeding that of the Ladies' Home Journal. It has been an interesting job, and I have had lots of fun with my share of it.
After the war, women openly entered politics and the workplace. In her magazine articles, Gene Stratton-Porter, with her usual independence of thought and action, was a popular spokesperson.
Suffrage came as a gift. During the war, women were forced to do a man's work. They learned the joy of being able to put hands into their purses and to draw forth $1 and spend it as they pleased. It is a pleasure they will not relinquish easily. Now I want to arouse every woman in the United States to the knowledge of the deep responsibility and the immense power for good that was put in her hand with the ballot. I want to plead with every man and woman to lay aside the selfish interests of homes and individual businesses, and in the unselfish interests of the nation as one great home, to select from either party the level best that it has to offer, and combine these two in the affairs of running our government, providing for us a land that is not tax-ridden to destruction, that is not unsafe for the rearing of our young.
One of her Gene Stratton-Porter pages takes up the eternal problem of fair work in the home.
I am appalled at the number of appeals that come from women with large families. They are overworked. They want an easier time for their children than they had. They are assuming the duties and burdens of the entire household. You cannot do your child a greater kindness than to teach it to help itself. If it is turned out into the world with no resourcefulness and no self-reliance, it may have a pretty difficult time.
The popularity of her novels in magazine columns at their peak, Gene Stratton-Porter gave her support to the Isaac Walton League's campaign against the destruction of the Mississippi bottomlands. Jeanne wrote an open letter to President Coolidge.
My dear Mr. President, if I were asking anything for myself, this letter would never be written. But we are now facing the drainage crime of a century. It is proposed to drain the whole upper Mississippi bottoms. With all my heart, I beg that if it is humanly possible, you will for a few hours forget your heavy burdens and spend that time in deep study of our position here in this stretch of country, if this drainage crime is allowed to go through. No greater lie ever was told to farmers and to agricultural interests than the lie which states that land that has been water-soaked since the dawn of creation contains sufficient humus and nitrates for agricultural purposes. And this is a truth that you will realize if you stop to think about it and make a little scientific investigation. Very truly your friend, Gene Stratton-Porter.
Before 1905, the movement was carried forward by conservationists like John Muir, acting from a desire to save Yosemite and the redwoods. Although John Muir pointed out the purpose of forest in preventing land erosion, few understood from experience, as Gene Stratton-Porter did, how indiscriminate and widespread destruction of forest and marshlands could cause serious changes in rainfall patterns.
It was Thoreau who, in writing of the destruction of the forests, exclaimed, "Thank heaven they cannot cut down the clouds." But they can. If men in their greed cut forests that preserve and distill moisture, clear fields, take the shelter of trees from creeks and rivers until they evaporate, and drain the water from swamps so that they can be cleared and cultivated, they prevent vapor from rising. And if it does not rise, it cannot fall. Man can change, and is changing, the forces of nature. Man can cut down the clouds. Living in Los Angeles, I was drawn to the possibilities offered by the filming of my popular novels.
By 1920, there were 20,000 motion picture theaters in the United States, drawing audiences to full-length silent films.
About this time, Mother began to see that pictures could be made from her books. She had 25 million readers. She considered that sufficient audience to warrant the success of the pictures. She was assured by producers that the pictures would not be popular because there were no violent sex problems and there was too much nature and sugary romance.
Michael O'Halloran, her first picture, was greeted by moderate success at the box office.
Jeanette and James Leo Meehan worked together on the screenplay of Michael O'Halloran. This partnership eventually grew into a marriage. I was happy that my daughter and grandchildren would have a stable home life, and I plunged into new projects.
When A Girl of the Limberlost was released, Jeanne replied to a letter from the president of the Federation of Women's Clubs.
I am delighted that you find A Girl of the Limberlost a beautiful and instructive picture. The whole thing hinges on this point. Are the home people, the church people, and the school people sincere when they say they want better pictures?
The public answered this question by filling the theater seats. The popularity of this picture and those to follow put Gene Stratton-Porter Productions in the top 5 successful filmmakers of the 1920s. With the addition of a baby grandson, James, born to Jeanette and James Leo Meehan, Jeanne wanted a home that would shelter the whole family in a natural setting.
Mother began plans for 2 California homes, one in Avalon, Santa Catalina Island, and the other in Bel Air.
On 5 acres of land on a baby mountain, I'm going to set my workshop and around it begin growing the wildflowers of California. Santa Catalina Island lies off the coast of California. The other day, from a boat, I noticed a flock of white gulls flying over one of those exquisite light jade green bays. I like it so well here that I'm going to begin my winter's work on a new book, The Keeper of the Bees.
Ahead of her time, Gene Stratton-Porter conceived The Keeper of the Bees as a magazine series, a book, and a motion picture from its inception. The Keeper of the Bees tells the story of Jamie, a wounded World War I veteran who wanders away from an Army hospital and finds a cure in the home of a beekeeper, learning to care for the bees himself. He finds health in California's sun and saltwater. Again, Gene Stratton-Porter created Scout, a character based on a member of her own family, Jeanette's youngest daughter, Little Jean. In the film, Little Jean portrayed Scout, this tomboy of a girl. When Jamie decides to become the beekeeper, Scout warns him.
The bees know it like a shot if you're mean, and they haven't got a bit of mercy. When they get a whiff of what you are, they puncture your tire. If you know, down deep inside you, that you ain't right, you better throw up this job and let me hunt someone else to look after the bees.
The Keeper of the Bees, more than any of Gene Stratton-Porter's other books, portrays a man striving to reclaim his lost faith in God, a loss that afflicted many men after World War I. Full of plans to complete her Bel Air home and gather Jeanette, James, her granddaughters, new baby grandson, and others for her family into its 22 rooms, Jeanne made plans for Christmas in their new home.
Early in December, Mother took a motor trip with my husband and me. She went with us on her first trip through Muir Woods. She was awed by the grandeur of the redwoods, by the flowers and the gorgeous ferns. We returned home the 4th of December, and it was on the evening of December 6th that her automobile was struck by a streetcar just 2 blocks from her home. The light of the great gray eyes went out suddenly, and it did not come back.
Gene Stratton-Porter was interred in Hollywood Cemetery, contrary to her expressed desire to be buried out in the open with a tree on her grave. 75 years later, Jeanne finally got her wish. The remains of Mrs. Porter and her daughter Jeanette were moved from California to Wildflower Woods, the Indiana home she often called Limberlost North.
Isn't this beautiful? We are so happy to have this here. And as I say, this is where she wanted to be, and this is where she should be. And because of the family and the state of Indiana, she is here.
Many attended the memorial ceremony, including her 2 grandsons.
We formulated the plan to get the grandmother and mother's bodies disinterred, as they call it, and brought back here.
They've done a wonderful job, and it's glad, delighted to see Jeanne and Mom back here again. You know, it was amazing to me when I came back here in 1993 and saw what a potent source she was back here. And I think that's what started the ball rolling, the 2 of us thinking about it was time to make some moves.
Jeanne died before I was born, so of course I never knew her at all.
Kind of sorry Jeanne didn't live at least 10 years longer.
Yes,
if she had, why, I'm sure one of the other of us, I know I would have been up to her hip like a pocket, following her through the woods and the swamps and catching all the wildlife and taking pictures of them and whatnot. But she was a grand lady. Unfortunately, I was but 6 months old when she left us.
At the same time, the new carriage house was dedicated to serve as a center for education. The Gene Stratton-Porter State Historic Site attracts visitors and new readers hungry to learn more about this remarkable woman. Gene Stratton-Porter's books were selling over 1,000 copies a day. They were translated into many foreign languages, and they have never gone out of print.
What we need is a literature that speaks about the great community, not just human beings, but all the creatures who share the land and share our places with us. And Gene Stratton-Porter, early in this century, gave us such a literature of the great community. We ought to be reading her again.
She drew readers to her, almost as part of a family, speaking to them of her concern for their well-being in the common home nature had provided for them.
We as a nation have already, in the most wanton and reckless waste the world has ever known, changed our climactic conditions and wasted a good part of our splendid heritage. The question now facing us is whether we shall do all that lies in our power to save the spots of natural beauty that remain for our children.
Gene Stratton-Porter's message is heard today by readers worldwide, but most of all in her home state of Indiana, where the Limberlost is being reborn.
As a local farm owner, I could see the struggles of other farmers trying to raise corn and soybeans in the drained Limberlost swamp fields. When our family moved to the Limberlost area, I saw the flooding for the first time. This was the land that Gene Stratton-Porter wrote about in her books. The constant flooding made me realize a better use of the land would be to restore some of the swamp. Some local landowners agreed to sell us their land, and the Limberlost Swamp Remembered project began.
In the 1880s, when Gene Stratton-Porter lived here, Indiana still had most of its 5 million or so acres of wetlands. We've subsequently lost most of those, and yet millions of acres are restorable. The significance of this particular restoration at the Limberlost is that because it inspired the writings of Gene Stratton-Porter and inspired her as a conservationist, these wetlands have both cultural and ecological significance. The legacy of the restoration project that the Fish and Wildlife Service works with, the Limberlost Swamp Remembered project, and others, is that we are showing that landowners have the power to restore the pre-settlement landscape of Indiana.
I have had a stiff battle to fight in an effort to preserve the forests, to preserve the water, to preserve the birds and the flowers for the people who would have this world as an inheritance from us. You know that my heart is irrevocably bound up in the love of nature, in an overwhelming desire to preserve the beauty of the gift that God has given us in our great land.
Oh, the moonlight's fair tonight along the Wabash. From the fields there comes the breath of new-mown hay. Through the sycamores the candle lights are gleaming.
To read the books of Gene Stratton-Porter, visit your local library or bookstore, or call for a free catalog of her books from Indiana University Press, 1-800-842-6796. Write to Indiana University Press at 601 North Morton Street, Bloomington, Indiana, 47404. Be sure to visit the 2 homes of Gene Stratton-Porter, now State Historic Sites. The Gene Stratton-Porter State Historic Site, called Wildflower Woods or Limberlost North, is located 5 miles west of Kendallville on US 6 and 3 miles north on Indiana 9 near Rome City. Also visit the Limberlost State Historic Site at the Limberlost Cabin, 1 block east of US 27 in Geneva, Indiana.